Holly, and I'm here with History Masters student Cameron for today's History Revision session on the successes and failures of the League of Nations. What was the League of Nations? Who was involved?
So, the League of Nations was initially established as a bit of a precursor to the United Nations, and what it is set up for was to settle international disputes as a collective order in the 20th century. It was set up at the Treaty of Versailles, which every nation hated secretly. It was created to provide a forum for resolving international disputes. It had 58 nation members by the 1930s. However, Germany, Russia, and interestingly, the United States were not a part of it at this point. Its aims were very ambitious, though, and it was to enforce its will. It would offer arbitration through courts of an international justice and apply trade sanctions against countries that went to war, even though it had no army to enforce this rule. Its organisation was cumbersome, and decisions within the League of Nations had to be unanimous. And that is a quick recap of the League of Nations itself, but we need to focus on the successes and failures of the League overall.
So, there's a lot of debate to whether or not the League was successful in what it aimed to do. So, before discussing everything and anything, which side do you lean towards?
Overall, I like the idea of what it actually established, and again, as the precursor to the United Nations. It did have some good ground, and it was a very good idea. However, as we'll talk throughout, it wasn't really fulfil that legacy that it should have, in my opinion. In the 1920s, the League was very successful, and its work for a better world really did do some good.
But when it was faced with a strong nation prepared to ignore it, what would the League do?
Effectively, nothing. What this was bound upon was a collective agreement. So when one of the major players would disagree and go against the grain, there wasn't really much they could do.
They had no army.
No, and with the smaller countries, the ones who don't have the better economies, the ones who are more dependent on other nation states, it's brilliant for them. And obviously because there's strength in numbers. However, if there is a strong nation, nothing really can do. As well as trying to stop disputes between countries, the League of Nations was also trying to make the world just a better place to live in.
Remember, when listening along as part of your revision, it would be helpful to list points and arguments you'd use to explain whether they were successful in these two aims in stopping disputes between countries and making the world a better place to live in. Let's work through it and see whether they were successful. Considering that World War I had just ended and all these countries had lost men, don't you think it's surprising the amount of disputes that still went on between countries after all of this?
Yeah, well, if you think about it though, countries have always had tensions. Wherever there's the will of man, there is always conflict of interests.
What were some of the successes in the League in solving these disputes?
Well, as previously said, in 1921, Sweden and Finland accepted League's arbitrations to give the island lands to Finland by coming in there as a third party to say no.
Stop that.
Yes.
Pack it in.
And then it just came in as a neutral party to say, you know what, no, the islands, they should be going to Finland. Another success in 1925 was Greece obeyed the League of Nations to pull out of Bulgaria, thus stopping an invasion of Bulgaria by the Greeks.
See, that would have ended in war or...
That would have been more bloodshed in Middle Europe. However, there was failures that came alongside the League of Nations. In 1921, the Poles invaded Vilna, the capital of Lithuania. The League ordered Poland to withdraw, but Poland refused, and the League could do absolutely nothing. Another one, in 1923, Mussolini ignored the League's order to pull out of Corfu and made Greece pay money to Italy, therefore just completely bypassing the League of Nations and ignoring what they've said. And another one is in 1928, 65 countries signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, a treaty to end war, but then they just ignored it. So as you can see, they don't really have and they don't actually have a way of enforcing this rule. It's all done as word of mouth and as an agreement
It's
However-
easy enough just to go,
Yeah, and
forget about that.
and this is where the League of Nations generally does fall through. It's because it doesn't actually have the power to enforce as the UN does in today's climate.
And out of 10, how good would you say the League was at stopping conflict between countries?
Well, this was in the interwar periods, which therefore says there was two big wars, one before and one after.
Yeah.
I'd like to say it wasn't that good at stopping conflicts. However, that is with the bigger nations. With the smaller nations that are more willing to comply, it was very effective. I would have to give it a 3.
3 out of 10.
Yes.
The third aim of the League of Nations was to make the world a better place by improving people's working conditions and tackling disease. How successful would you say the League of Nations was in its work for a better world in the 1920s?
Oh, I think this is quite an interesting point. And there are successes. In 1920, the League took home 500,000 prisoners of war from World War One. In 1923, the League sent economic experts to help Austria when its government went bankrupt. In 1926, the League approved the Slavery Convention. Altogether, the League freed over 200,000 slaves. Which is nice.
That's a fair amount.
Some of these successes coming through, they're really, really powerful. And another one being through, like 1936, after more than 10 years of work, 26 League nations signed an international convention to combat the drugs trade, a law that today is still enforced by many nations. In the 1920s, the League worked to prevent malaria and leprosy amongst all countries that are together. And also, 1922, the League set up camps and fed Turkish refugees. So there was an atmosphere of help and wanting to actually make a change as a group. However, helping people didn't always come with the successes. There was some failures that came alongside. In 1923 and 1932, disarmament talks failed because Germany demanded as many weapons as everyone else. And obviously this comes as a straight contradiction to the Treaty of Versailles, which limited the German army from building up. It completely stopped them from having an air force. They can only have about 50,000 soldiers, I do believe. I could be wrong there. But they completely hindering the German force just so they couldn't create another world war. Which,
well, you saw how that went.
Hindsight's lovely in this situation. But also, another failure of the UN is in 1920s, the International Labour Organization failed to persuade countries to adopt a 48-hour work week, which in itself is an interesting one. Because obviously a lot of nations are a bit more progressive in today's society. There are still countries now where they don't have a regulated hour work for the week. But you could say that it was before its time, and I think generally overall with the League of Nations it was very before its time.
Out of 10, how good would you say the League of Nations was at making the world a better place?
I'd have to give it a middle of the road 5, because there was change and it did bring forth change. However, it was limited in what it was. It could have done so much more.
So now I'm going to ask you whether you think the League was a success or a failure overall in the 1920s.
I do find that there is some successes actually within the League of Nations. Again, I keep harrowing back to the fact that it's the precursor to the United Nations. The idea of this collective unit helping out, there is good there, and that is a way to progress forward in our modern society with modern nations. However, I think what it actually implied doing for countries, a lot of them was not ready for. Because following in the 20s, states are still struck by all the devastation that World War One caused, especially in Europe.
They're just trying to recover, really.
They are. And whilst the League of Nations seems like a very intellectual decision, people are driven by whether their bellies are hungry and whether they're going to be scared they're going to get hurt. And then when the League of Nations is wanting money from them or to put together, sometimes countries will be like, I don't really want to put this out, because the people within will be like, we haven't got this money, so why should you send that money over to somewhere else?
it led to what's in place today with the United Nations. So it's more like a stepping stone, I'd say.
It is. It's the first. It's the baby steps towards change, and change doesn't come easy.
Well, there's our final verdict, everybody, and goodbye from us for this session. To further your revision, why not check out the podcast this came from? Woodrow Wilson, who initially
came up with the idea. Yeah, you're right there. Woodrow Wilson really wanted to get this collective idea going, but following the 19th century